Hi. Chapter 7. Vanishing Act. Mrs. Tibblethwaite was having remarkable success with Seaguard. She bossed him about like nobody's business, but the Viking smiled and laughed and nodded. He was soon very well on his way to becoming a star waiter. Meanwhile, Mrs. Tibblethwaite was often to be seen wearing Seaguard's helmet. She looked quite the part. The 2 weeks of Mrs. Tibblethwaite's stay passed very quickly. Mr. and Mrs. Ellis did not want the stout lady to go, as she proved so helpful around the hotel. Tim and Zoe were both very fond of her, because although she often had a strict and bossy manner, her heart was soft as a king-size duvet. And when Seaguard discovered that Mrs. Tibblethwaite was leaving, he went to pieces completely. He tore at his hair, stamped up and down the stairs, frightened all the guests with his shouts and raging. Nobody understood a word he said. It was all in his own tongue. He would not lift a finger to help in the hotel. In short, the Viking had gone on strike. Mrs. Tibblethwaite was upset as well. She did not like to see Seaguard so unhappy. Upstairs in her bedroom, she went and tried to knit a jumper to take her mind off everything. The idea did not seem to work very well, as she ended up with the only jumper in the world that had 3 arms, no neck, and a sock attached to one sleeve. There you go, look, there's a jumper. Can you see? 3 arms and a sock and no neck. That'd be a bit hard to get on, wouldn't it? Can't Mrs. Tibblethwaite stay? Pleaded Zoe. It's really up to her, explained Mrs. Ellis. Can't she work here? Zoe went on. Her mother stopped and looked at her in surprise. I don't know, Zoe. It never occurred to me. I don't suppose she would want to work here. She's got her own home, hasn't she? Even so, Mrs. Ellis became very thoughtful after Zoe's suggestion and decided she would talk to her husband about it as soon as possible. But there were other problems that needed seeing to first. All the chicken had disappeared from the kitchen table. Mrs. Ellis was certain she'd taken 3 chickens from the fridge, ready to roast for lunch. When she couldn't see them, she decided her husband must already have put them in the oven to roast. When Mr. Ellis couldn't find them in the fridge, he thought she must have put them in the oven. It was now almost lunchtime, and they both went to the oven to get the chickens. But the chickens weren't there. They had quite disappeared. Mr. and Mrs. Ellis looked at each other and said the same thing. Seaguard. They raced upstairs to his room, where they found the Viking moping on his bed. Mr. Ellis hauled him to his feet. Chickens! What have you done with the chickens? Chickens, repeated Seaguard. It was not a word he'd heard before. Yes, chickens, roared Mr. Ellis frantically. He began to strut up and down in the room with his fists tucked under his armpits and his elbows waggling. Park, park, park. Seaguard's eyes grew wider and wider. He took off his helmet and scratched his head. Mrs. Ellis hurriedly joined her husband. Park, 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 park. Seaguard's eyes grew wider and wider. He took off his helmet and scratched his head. Mrs. Ellis hurriedly joined her husband. Chickens! Cried Seaguard suddenly with a big smile. He nodded ferociously. Thank goodness he understands, pointed Mr. Ellis. But the Viking was now on his hands and knees, and he began to crawl around the room. Woof, 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 woof. Seaguard looked up at Mrs. Ellis with his tongue hanging from his mouth. Ruff. I don't believe it. He thinks this is a game, moaned Mrs. Ellis. He grabbed Seaguard and pulled him to his feet. Seaguard, chickens, where are they? We want to eat. Eat chickens. Lunchtime, understand? Oh. Hi guys, sorry about that. Mrs. Street was coming in giving me really funny looks, thinking I was going nutty talking to myself. But I was talking to you lot, wasn't I? Where did we get to? They're looking for the chickens. And they're walking around like woof, 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 pretending he's a dog. Seaguard paused and regarded Mr. Ellis coolly. I show you, he said calmly, and marched downstairs. He took them outside and pointed up to the porch roof. This had a triangular point with a wooden spike at each corner. There was a farm fresh, oven ready chicken stuck on each spike. Look at that. Do you think he's trying to cook 'em in the sunshine on top of the hotel? That was a bit strange. Mr. Ellis was about to break into a war dance when he saw the expression on Sigurd's face. The Viking was gazing upwards, his eyes half closed and his arms raised to the heavens. "Hear me, Odin," the Viking cried. "Hear me, Thor. Hear me, all the gods in Valhalla. Take my small offering and seek out to the heart of Mrs. Dufflute. She no go away. Speak to the hearts of Mr. Ellis and Mrs. Ellis, Tim and Zoe, who look after me. They no send Mrs. Dufflecoat." Sigurd slowly lowered his arms. Mrs. Ellis gave him a small nod and led Sigurd back indoors. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't understand." "Go back upstairs, Sigurd, and we'll cook beef burgers instead." Mr. Ellis was suddenly taken by an idea. He went straight to Mrs. Tibblethwaite, explained the problem and asked her how she could solve it. Mrs. Tibblethwaite looked him in the eye and said that the answer was perfectly obvious. "You offer me a job and I say yes. Then I stay here and everyone is happy." And that was how Mrs. Tibblethwaite came to work at the Viking Hotel. As for the chickens, they stayed up on the porch roof for a very long time. Zoe explained that it was quite normal for Vikings to make offerings like that. Usually it was a pig or a cow, I think. We learned about it at school. Whether it was the chickens on the porch roof, Sigurd or Mrs. Tibblethwaite, no one could be sure, but more and more and more people wanted to come and stay at the Viking Hotel. The hotel was soon doing a great business, with all rooms full and booked for months to come. The summer season ended with a great flurry Viking carnival. People all over the town had been preparing for weeks. It was a grand event, with parades along the streets, bands playing and Viking feast in the evening. There was a dancing too. Sigurd was like a small child. When he first saw the streets filled with Vikings, he thought Ulrich Blacktooth had found him at last. He sat at the front window watching with a pensive, faraway look in his eye. Zoe sat down beside him. She thought he would be excited and happy. Today of all days, this was quite unexpected. "You're thinking about home, aren't you, Ziggy?" "Hate be," grinned Ziggy. Seeing all the people dressed like Vikings made his heart ache. Zoe left him to think alone. Later that evening they all went down to the harbour where the grand feast and dance were to take place. Riding the waves in the harbour was a small boat, all done up like a Viking longship. It had shields along the sides and a striped sail. It even had a dragon's head prow, made from painted egg boxes. Sigurd gazed at it with a curious smile and said, "Baby boat," which made everyone laugh. They went in to dance and left Siggy standing by the harbour looking out to sea. "He'll be all right," said Tim. "I'll go and have a word with him," said Mrs. Tibblethwaite. "I'll see if I can get him to come and have a dance." She set off along the harbour wall. It was over half an hour later that Mr. Ellis suddenly realised he hadn't seen either Sigurd or Mrs. Tibblethwaite come into the hall. Everyone had finished eating already, and there was no sign of them. His heart missed a beat as the truth came to him. "Zoe, Tim, Penny, quickly, follow me." They pushed through the dancing crowds and out into the warm summer air. A brief glance at the harbour told them all they needed to know. The Viking longship had gone. They raced along the harbour wall and stared out across the dark sea. "Nothing," muttered Mr. Ellis. "I can't see a thing." "There, over there, right on the horizon," yelled Zoe. Far, far out to sea was a tiny sail. They watched it as long as possible until it became a speck, and then gone. The Ellises walked back to the hotel in a deep silence. On the porch steps they stopped and looked up at three very totty old chickens. "Give them a safe voyage, Odin," said Mr. Ellis, and they went back inside. It was well past midnight when there was a loud knock on the front door. Mr. Ellis went down in his dressing gown. Outside were two extremely wet figures. One was short and stout, the other was tall and hairy. "We went round and round," grinned Seaguard. "He can't sail for toffee," giggled Mrs. Tibblethwaite. "He's totally hopeless. First of all, he lost an oar." "Don't tell me," butted Mr. Ellis. "Big waves, very wet," said Seaguard. "Sail come down." He was underneath, of course," Mrs. Tibblethwaite put in. "Then he struggled to get out, and he couldn't see what he was doing and kicked me overboard." "Gurgle, gurgle," grinned Seaguard. "Sail go dropsy flopsy. Mrs. Dufflecoat make big splash." She made very, very big splash. "Well, that's quite enough of that, Seaguard. You made a big splash too." Mrs. Tibblethwaite turned back to Ellis. "He fell in as well, of course." "Gurgle, gurgle," added Mr. Ellis. "Come on inside, the pair of you." He began to switch on the hotel lights. "Penny, Zoe, Tim, come downstairs. We have some important guests who have just arrived." Seaguard stood in the hallway in a big puddle. There was a big puddle of water collecting around his feet. "Tomorrow I make offering to thank gods in Valhalla for safe return," he said. "That will be fine, Seaguard," said Mrs. Ellis. "You can have a slice of bacon and no more. We haven't only got pigs or cows or sheep, so a slice of bacon will have to do." Seaguard stood and grinned at everyone like a huge happy child. Suddenly he grabbed Mrs. Tibblethwaite and gave her an enormous kiss. Seaguard liked Mrs. Dufflecoat very much. "Oh, Siggy!" Mrs. Tibblethwaite had turned bright red. "We move you," declared Seaguard with his idiotic smile. Then he grabbed her once more. "Me love you." "All right, that's enough," said Mrs. Ellis. "Stop it at once. It's time we ended this." Ah, Seaguard loves Mrs. Tibblethwaite. There you go. They're all together back in the hotel. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story about there's a Viking in my bed. That was good, wasn't it? It was funny. I'm going to let you have a couple days now without a story, because when we start back after half term, there's going to be a new story, and that is to do with our topic and our guided reading. I'm not going to let you know what it is yet. You'll have to find out. See you later. Enjoy your week off. Bye.